Our third speaker today is Christina Bieber Lake, who's an associate professor at Wheaton College in English, and she teaches classes on contemporary American literature and literary theory. She's the author of The Incarnational Art of Flannery O'Connor. She's also the author of the forthcoming book, Prophets of the Posthuman, American Fiction, Biotechnology, and the Ethics of Personhood, a project that explores through contemporary fiction theological and ethical implications of the biotechnological quest for human enhancement. So another interesting area of writing. Among other things, she touts on her website that she's a Chicago Bears fan, and I want to say how much I like the Chicago Bears too, because I'm a Green Bay Packer fan and they give us 2 guaranteed victories every year. So with that, let me introduce Christina.
There's so much I could say. I was going to graciously thank Chris. Now I'm not so sure I can be gracious nor thankful. No, truly, thank you, Chris. It's been wonderful to be invited here and to be with Bill and Ralph, who are my good friends. Although if I had known I was going to have to follow the Ralph-Bill duet, I might not have agreed to this, but no, that was fun. Well, I have always been glad that my primary scholarly work has been centered around the fiction of Flannery O'Connor. There are many benefits of a life spent thinking about the profound theological and aesthetic insights of this self-declared hillbilly Thomist. But another, perhaps more hidden benefit comes from the fact that she is consistently, wickedly, laugh out loud funny. And so all I have to do is stand up here and read her stuff and you think I'm funny. What's not to love about that, right? So that's why I'm going to begin my exploration of my favorite story, which is Good Country People, by relating one of O'Connor's famous exchanges regarding, actually, the life you save may be your own. It's May 1955, and Flannery has just learned that she will be going to New York to be interviewed by Harvey Bright about the NBC TV film adaptation of her story, The Life You Save May Be Your Own. Partly because of her illness, Flannery did not like to travel very much, and she often indicated this fact in various letters. In one letter, she wrote that the, quote, opening section of The Life You Save is going to be dramatized on the same program, and as no New Yorker has any insight into what comes out of the South, I know it will be a mess. Actors without shoes, New Jersey hillbilly voices, etc., etc. And then I have a mental picture of my glacial glare being sent out over the nation onto millions of children who are waiting impatiently for the Batman to come on. I am fast getting a reputation out of all proportion to my desire for one, and this largely because I am now competing with the Lone Ranger. Everybody here shakes my hand, but nobody reads my stories, which is just as well. When she returned, she wrote that, quote, the television was mildly ghastly, and I am very glad to be back with the children, with the chickens who don't know I have just published a book. O'Connor always knew that many people were just not going to get her stories. But that doesn't mean that the fact wasn't frustrating to her. The Life You Save May Be Your Own is one of her darkest stories, and its basic plot concerns Tom T. Shiflett, who swindles Lucy Nell Crater into thinking he wants to marry her mentally diminished daughter, also named Lucy Nell Crater, so that he could take their car on a honeymoon with her and then leave her in a restaurant while he drives off with the car. So O'Connor dealt with the fact that people couldn't really seem to accept these kinds of dark stories and dark reality of them by laughing about it with her friends and her confidence. So when she sold the television rights to the story, The Life You Save, she wrote this: all I know about television is hearsay, but somebody told me that this was a production conducted by Ronald Reagan. I don't know if this means RR will be Mr. Shiflett or not. A staggering thought. Mr. Shiflett and the idiot daughter will no doubt go off in a Chrysler and live happily ever after. Anyway, on account of this, I am buying my mother a new refrigerator. While they make hash out of my story, she and me will make ice in the new refrigerator. O'Connor knew that once she let go of it into the fairyland ether of television production, it was out of her control. And so a few months later she wrote that I have, quote, just learned via one of those gossip columns that the story I sold for a TV play is going to be put on in the spring, and that a tap dancer by the name of Gene Kelly is going to make his television debut in it. The punishment always fits the crime. They must be going to make a musical out of it. I could go on reading these letters all day, but the purpose of my talk is to explain why Flannery O'Connor, while being fiercely funny, so adamantly and consistently resisted giving any of her stories a classically happy ending. And by extension, I hope to provide insight into why her stories often end in ways that many people simply cannot accept, with the protagonist either dead in a ditch, gored by a bull, drowned, shot to death, hanging dead, crying beside a tree, sick in bed, having killed one's granddaughter with a rock or one's mother with a gun, and so on. And what I'm going to argue today is that the key to Flannery O'Connor's resistance to the happy ending lies in her particular and unique employment of the satirical grotesque. Her work manages the truly extraordinary feat of being both theologically serious and satirically cutting. And the combination produces realism of the sort that refuses to let Americans get away with one more minute of self-deception. As you will discern from my talk today, I think that people's tendencies towards self-deception was O'Connor's ultimate target. As a side note, I know full well that when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about it in the presence of my friend Ralph Wood, who has written a definitive book, I think, on O'Connor's use of comedy. So you should check his book out, The Comedy of Redemption, Christian Faith, and Comic Vision, and for American Novelists. He and I are in happy agreement about this topic, except perhaps on our views of the ending of the river. Maybe sometime we can talk about that. So what I'm doing today is not a challenge to his argument. I'm simply focusing more specifically on O'Connor's resistance to the whole idea of a happy ending, primarily by discussing one of her stories that, for O'Connor at least, has a very happy ending, actually, and that is when Joy Holga gets left up in a barn loft without her wooden leg and no way to get down. That's a happy ending for O'Connor. All right. Perhaps the best way I can begin to show how the satirical and the serious work is by making a brief comparison of her vision to two different kinds of movies, Shrek 2 and The Matrix. When Shrek 2 first came out, I imagined Flannery as the 80-year-old woman she would have been at that time, had she lived, at her dairy farm in Milledgeville, sitting next to her crutches that she called her flying buttresses, and cracking jokes while she watched this satirical take on fairy tales. I think she would have liked the movie's ending in particular. Fairy tales, at least when taken over by Disney, almost always end in marriage, as do many of the novels that have inevitably comprised our literary diet from childhood on. It's a great fantasy that Americans still love in our stories, right? Marriage as telos, as end, with everything else summed up and also avoided in the line, and they lived happily ever after. Shrek 2 already subverts this fantasy by beginning the story with the return of the couple from their honeymoon, and it continues to depict the couple's arguments, their run-ins with the expectations of in-laws, a huge family dispute involving a glorious food fight, and other roadblocks. And in the movie's climax, Fiona and Shrek, having started out their marriage as everyday, homely ogres, have a chance to remain the handsome prince and beautiful princess that they had been magically turned into. That's the plot of the story. The ultimate decision, fittingly, belongs to Fiona, who, unlike Shrek, had not been an ogre her whole life, but who had chosen to be one in order to be with Shrek. Shrek loves her, and so he wants to give her the choice. Is this what you want? Kiss me now, and we can stay like this forever. That's how you would keep the spell, if you could just kiss him in that state. Fiona makes her decision very quickly and says, quote, I want what every fairy princess wants, to live happily ever after with the ogre I married. So it's a brilliant line, and I can imagine Flannery O'Connor grinning behind those black plastic horn-rimmed glasses that had only recently come back into style. Because if there was one thing her stories defied, it was the whole fantasy, the cheating ending of happily ever after. Her opposition to those illusions and the sentimentality they engender was for more than just sarcastic laughs. Her reasons for writing against the fantasy of happily ever after were stronger than just the standard protest of the realist novelist, who insists on giving us the world as it is. I think her reasons for fighting against sentimentality were stronger, and actually, Ralph, the things you were saying earlier completely concord with this. So what's the difference? Well, since we're already imagining dead writers responding to contemporary movies, let's imagine the staunchest realists or naturalists, or at least the pessimists in American fiction, like Theodore Dreiser, Jack London, maybe Ernest Hemingway, Richard Wright, Cormac McCarthy, if you like that, sitting around in a pub discussing the choice presented in the second movie that I want to talk about, The Matrix. I assume most of you have seen it, but I can't assume that anymore, right? But in case you haven't, the movie presents a real world that has been taken over by vicious machines who use human bodies for fuel while they hook their minds up to a virtual world that the humans believe is real. They believe it until glitches in the system cause some of them to doubt, and then they find out it's a great deception, right? The whole Matrix is a deception. At one point in the movie, the protagonist, a character named Neo, discovers this truth and then is captured by the machines and given a choice, right? He has to decide whether he wants to swallow the blue pill and to continue to live blissfully ignorant in the computer-generated matrix of virtual reality, which is the only world he has ever known, or swallow the red pill and enter the real world of human resistance underground. There's no sunlight and only gruel to eat. Now, just imagine how these literary realists I was just talking about would respond to the situation. I think they all would have said, he's got to take the red pill, right? If the world as it is bleak, it's a fight for your life, it's constant uphill climb. Hemingway might even throw into the conversation his remark that, quote, all true stories end in death, and he is no true storyteller. Who will keep that from you? Were Flannery O'Connor in on this august pub talk, she would no doubt agree that Neo's only choice is the red pill. She had no problem staring reality in the face and ending her stories with literal death. But she would also completely resist the false dichotomy that the Matrix movie represents, as if you can have either all fantasy or hopeless dreariness. She would probably insist that in actuality, the real fantasy of the movie is the idea that the real world created by God could ever be that bleak. Our real world is instead, to borrow a line from Gerard Manley Hopkins, charged with the grandeur of God. And no matter how downtrodden, it will flame out like shining from shook foil. In other words, in contrast to the Gnostic vision portrayed in The Matrix, the real world is created by God and therefore good and worthy of the fiction writer's honest attention. But it is also fallen, full of perversion and evil, and therefore in need of redemption. For Flannery O'Connor, this redemption has been provided in the literal death and resurrection of Jesus. When she called herself a Christian realist, she said it was because for the truly Christian writer, quote, the ultimate reality is the incarnation, the present reality is the incarnation, the whole reality is the incarnation, and nobody believes in the incarnation. That is, nobody in your audience. My audience are the people who think God is dead. At least these are the people I am conscious of writing for. For Flannery O'Connor, the sad part of the human story in general, and the American story in particular, is that we've turned away from this reality and turned toward all kinds of fantasies that we think make the world, well, a little easier to swallow. So, what's the problem with Happily Ever After for O'Connor? It comes down to simply this. Using fiction to create a dreamlike escapist fantasy, while it seems like it's delivering a preferable world, actually keeps us from the riches that are our true inheritance in God. From God. Specifically, the construction of Happily Ever After in our fictions has three problems, and this is what I'm going to outline briefly today. The first and primary problem is that it prevents true self-knowledge, knowledge which is necessary for spiritual growth. Second, it promotes sentimentality instead of real love. And finally, it ends the story for us at the point where it should be beginning. To talk about these three problems, and I guess I can be a good Baptist now, with Happily Ever After, I have decided to focus on one O'Connor story that happens to be my favorite, Good Country People. This story is the ultimate foil to the classic boy meets girl story that is so nauseatingly familiar to us in our various fairy tale venues, from books to movies to TV. We just can't seem to get enough of the boy meets girl fantasy. In this story, the protagonist is not some beautiful and wistful teenage girl dreaming about her prince, but a 32-year-old homely woman named Joy, who has a PhD in philosophy and still lives at home with her mother. Her mother, a hopelessly naive and simple woman aptly named Mrs. Hopewell, just wants her daughter to date and to have normal good times, and cannot understand her daughter at all. O'Connor writes that, quote, "The girl had taken the PhD in philosophy, and this left Mrs. Hopewell at a complete loss." I love this part. You could say, "My daughter is a nurse," or "My daughter is a school teacher," or even, "My daughter is a chemical engineer." You could not say, "My daughter is a philosopher." That was something that had ended with the Greeks and Romans, end quote. Joy has fashioned herself into a typical intellectual consigned to life on the farm. She is above it all and mocks everything around her. She has even changed her own name to Holga, which her mother was convinced she chose just for the ugliness of it, but which she chose to assert her independence against the ways of her mother, and particularly against her simplistic faith in humanity. And she liked the ugly sound of it. Through her encounter with philosophy, Joy has decided that she has seen the world as it really is, and is now an atheist who believes in nothing. Her mother found the following passage underlined in one of her books, and these lines actually come from Heidegger. Quote, "Science, on the other hand, has to assert its soberness and seriousness afresh and declare that it is concerned solely with what is. Nothing. How can it be for science anything but a horror and a phantasm? If science is right, then one thing stands firm. Science wishes to know nothing of nothing. Such is, after all, the strictly scientific approach to nothing. We know it by wishing to know nothing of nothing," end quote. The narrator writes that these words, quote, "worked on Mrs. Hopewell like some evil incantation and gibberish." Also, in a typical O'Connor way, Joy has a wooden leg, which she proudly stomps around on as loudly as she possibly can, all the time dressed in a 6-year-old skirt and a yellow sweatshirt with a faded cowboy on a horse embossed on it. Just a wonderful picture. The plot revolves around the sudden appearance of a Bible salesman, also aptly named Manly Pointer. At first, Manly seems like the incarnation of what Mrs. Hopewell calls good country people. So, of course, she thinks he'd make the perfect date for Joy, her ticket to those normal good times. But Joy has her own designs for the Bible salesman. She decides that she's going to seduce him, just to demonstrate to herself and her mother how above it all she really is. So she takes him up in the barn loft and begins to kiss him, and he willingly obliges. But a curious thing happens. Rather than being in control, she finds herself caught up in the moment, and she actually begins to fall in love with him, particularly when he tenderly treats her wooden leg, understanding, or so she thinks, how special it makes her. Just as she begins to trust him, believing that he really must be good country people after all, he reveals his true identity. He's not a Bible salesman at all, but a drifter who goes around collecting things like he's now collecting Joy's wooden leg. And as he leaves, he proclaims, "And I'll tell you another thing, Holga, you ain't so smart. I've been believing in nothing ever since I was born." And then off he goes into the distance, leaving Joy alone with her thoughts. Now, I have said that O'Connor's primary problem with Happily Ever After is that it prevents true self-knowledge of the sort that is necessary for spiritual growth. Good Country People inverts the classic boy meets girl story in order to tell the much more vital story of self-discovery. Joy thinks she is independent and, above all, in control. She has decided, she has chosen to be an atheist. She's chosen to believe in nothing. And she might have died with this belief if it wasn't for the visit of Manly Pointer. In Manly Pointer, Joy gets an incarnation of her very own philosophy, right? Nothing is important, nothing is good. And as we heard earlier, that's what evil is the absence of good, right? He hurts her, providing her with full recognition of the barrenness of her beliefs. This is a classic moment of grace in O'Connor's fiction, because it is through her pain that Joy has been given the priceless gift of accurate self-knowledge. She gets knocked down a notch, which is precisely what she needs. It is, to put it very simply, God being kind through the world's cruelty. It is this strong desire to get people to see the truth about themselves that motivates O'Connor's fiction. It's a story she tells over and over again. It's also, I think, the best explanation for her use of the grotesque. The grotesque, which could be simply defined as the appearance of freaks or misfits or physically deformed people, or anything out of the ordinary or incongruous. It is a mode that is almost expected in Southern fiction, and that we have come to expect it in both the fiction of the South and in the South in general, that led O'Connor to joke in one of her essays that, quote, "I have found that anything that comes out of the South is going to be called grotesque by the Northern reader, unless it is grotesque, in which case it's going to be called realistic." I love that quote, and every Southern audience understands that intimately. O'Connor, however, employed the grotesque for distinctly spiritual reasons. She believed that her audience was so opposed to seeing any spiritual truth behind the ordinary world that she had to draw attention to it by employing grotesques. Her famous description of this move appears in her essay, The Fiction Writer in His Country, and you hear this all the time, but if you haven't heard it, it's a really important quote. She wrote that, quote, "When you can assume that your audience holds the same beliefs you do, you can relax a little and use more normal ways of talking to it. When you have to assume that it does not, then you have to make your vision apparent by shock. To the hard of hearing you shout, and for the almost blind, you draw large and startling figures." That's one of the best quotes we have from her to explain why she uses the grotesque. But what exactly is she drawing attention to? To what exactly have we grown blind? I think that the reason Flannery O'Connor found the grotesque so suitable to her purpose is that she wanted to draw attention to our embodiness, that which makes us, in Alistair McIntyre's words, dependent rational animals. We are not only created beings, but we are also broken, and in full denial of both those facts. Consequently, we desperately need a picture of our brokenness, and we need it in our face all the time. Joy's wooden leg is a literal picture of her dependence, but it also symbolizes the brokenness in her soul. O'Connor said this about the Southern writer's interest in the grotesque, quote, "Whenever I'm asked why Southern writers particularly have a penchant for writing about freaks, I say it is because we are still able to recognize one. To be able to recognize a freak, you have to have some conception of the whole man. And in the South, the general conception of man is still, in the main, theological." What she means by this is that Christian theology, particularly Catholic theology, ascribes the dignity of every human being to the fact of her being made in the image of God. The one who sees this way is also the only one who is able to see clearly what man has made of this image through the fall and our ongoing distortion of this truth, of the truth of our being made by God. The grotesque was for her both a real picture of our humility before God and a device to get her readers to pay attention to the brokenness in her characters and, of course, in themselves. So the first problem with the idea of happily ever after is that it prevents true self-knowledge. The second problem that O'Connor had with happily ever after is that it promotes sentimentality rather than love. And for her, these things are worlds apart. O'Connor had a pronounced disdain for the sentimental in fiction, particularly when it was written by Catholic writers. For her, the sentimental included any effort on the part of the writer to get an emotional response cheaply. And the classic example is the perfect little Eva in Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, who's this angel child, and we're supposed to cry over her when she dies. O'Connor was practically plagued by little old Catholic ladies who would write to her complaining that her stories were too dark, that they wanted something uplifting that would cheer them up. Her response to this complaint explains her problem with the sentimental in fiction. The sentimental overemphasizes our innocence when we in fact live in a world that's fallen. She blamed it on an American tendency toward Gnostic dualisms, which she called Manichaean, and she put it this way: if the average Catholic reader could be tracked down through the swamps of letters to the editors and other places where he momentarily reveals himself, he would be found to be more of a Manichaean than the church permits. By separating nature and grace as much as possible, he has reduced his conception of the supernatural to pious cliché and has become able to recognize nature in literature in only two forms, the sentimental and the obscene. He forgets that sentimentality is an excess, a distortion of sentiment usually in the direction of an overemphasis on innocence, and that innocence, wherever it is overemphasized in the ordinary human condition, tends by some natural law to become its opposite. And so that goes exactly with what Ralph was saying about comparing sentimentality to pornography, the same kind of cheap access to responses. O'Connor hated anything that made real joy and real spiritual truth look like a cliche. The defining feature of anything that has become cliche, of course, is its tendency to be completely ignored and overlooked. O'Connor spent her career creating characters and situations that we could not possibly overlook. What the sentimental in fiction overlooks is the fact that grace often has to be manifested as tough love in order for us to get anywhere. The sentimental wants God's work in our life to look warm and loving and happy all the time. But O'Connor strongly believed that when love is removed from truth-telling, it is not love at all. But because her readers wanted something uplifting, they often accused O'Connor of not loving her characters. To return to Joy Hulga up in the barn loft, these readers would point out that Joy's leg got stolen and she was abused and hurt by this. Or even more to the point, right? She got killed by the misfit. How could she possibly love that character? But O'Connor would emphasize that Manley's entrance into Joy's life was the most loving gift she could have given her. And Saint likewise, she'd have been a good woman if there had been somebody to shoot her every minute of her life. That's a gift. True self-knowledge, even if it lasts only a split second, right, is a good thing. If we go our whole lives without having our lies challenged, we may think ourselves to be happier, but the happiness is as thin as mere sentiment, not the thick, accepting nature of true love. True love is the kind of love that God offers, God who sees us in all of our brokenness and loves us anyway. Those critics who argued that O'Connor did not love her own characters inevitably point to A Good Man is Hard to Find, where the character gets shot by a misfit, Greenleaf, where the protagonist gets gored to death by a bull. But in each of these stories, O'Connor is only being true to Christian orthodoxy. That one moment of true self-assessment before death is worth far more than a lifetime spent in the living death of self-delusion. It is more loving, I would argue, that O'Connor presents characters in their brokenness, because that fact that she depicts them at all insists that all of us, no matter how far gone or how quirky, are made in God's image and worthy of redemption. To paraphrase Jesus, what credit is it for a writer to love only the lovable? The Russian theorist Mikhail Bakhtin wrote about the relationship between the writer and his characters. In his book, Toward a Philosophy of the Act, he argues, quote, "In aesthetic seeing, you love a human being not because he is good, but rather a human being is good because you love him." And I think the difference is crucial, and the writers understand this. The interesting thing about Good Country People is that in spite of herself, Joy actually understood that this kind of affirmation is what love is all about. She comes close to experiencing it in the moment that Manley Pointer, before he reveals his true identity, takes off her wooden leg and tells her that he wants to see it because it's what makes you different. She actually begins to surrender to him. And when she does give him the leg, the narrator records that it, quote, was like losing her own life and finding it again, miraculously, in his. Now, think about this language for a second. There have been lots of different interpretations about how it operates, including one that thinks it's burlesqued, but I think it's more serious than that. But if O'Connor had put that language of it was like losing her own life and finding it again miraculously in his, if she had put that in an uplifting story that she was trying to write about true love, we would go into sentimental mode. We might be tempted to escape, to lose our minds, start believing with our hearts, clamor after the happy ending, and so on. O'Connor believed that such an experience was much more limited in what it had to teach us. Here in her story, we have to use our minds and our hearts to recognize what is happening to Joy is much more sophisticated. She is finding out that she really does believe in love, and she really does want it, but that she has to learn the truth about her own convictions before that experience will have any real meaning for her. It is this expectation that realist fiction will make us use our minds and our hearts that leads me to my third point about the problem Flannery O'Connor had with Happily Ever After. It is that it tends to put an end to the story at exactly the point where it should be beginning. By end, I do not mean when the story literally ends, but where it ends in our thinking about it. Marriage as telos is the best example of this artificial curtailment, for its tacit message, its hidden agenda, seems to be that once you have found your true love, the work of living out that love is already done for you. End of story. And as everyone knows who's been married, not true. It locates love in the search, in the desire, in the moment of almost attaining, which is the only place where it can remain unsullied by human sin and error. In contrast to this fantasy ending, we have joy left up in the loft. The story literally ends here, but it is not by any stretch the real ending for joy. And I think that's important. And it's also, for O'Connor, not meant to be the real ending for us as readers. O'Connor consistently argued that the best stories were those that did not explain everything and sew it all up. She once wrote that, quote, "A story really isn't any good unless it successfully resists paraphrase, unless it hangs on and expands in the mind." That's one of my favorite quotes, because that is the objective for all of the stories, is to make it hang on and expand in our minds. In other words, we're sort of haunted by it. It stays with us, right? This is definitely a story that cannot but expand, because we're left to contemplate Joy's thoughts. What's next for her? I think it was brilliant for O'Connor not to give us those thoughts, though, because it makes us work a bit more when we close the book. Her point is to say that there's a whole range of responses available to us when the divine intersects our lives, and we do have real choices. Joy has real choices. She could reject the knowledge and find some way to hobble down the ladder and return to being Holga, or she could begin the life true to her given name by admitting the bankruptcy of her personal philosophy and turn toward a life of joy. The choice is left to her in the same way in which it is ultimately also left to us. So what's the problem with Happily Ever After? I hope it's now clear that it's not the concern that we will not see the world as a truly bad place that it is. It is rather, and somewhat paradoxically, that we will not see the world as the truly good and blessed place that it is, if we would only see it truthfully. We are, in short, more likely to truly live happily ever after when we recognize and realize or reconcile with the fact that we are all ogres, and that if we are married, we are all married to ogres, and that the thing to do is, with God's help, with God's grace, to joyfully work through, not over, not around, but through, that which makes us ogre-like in spirit. In short, O'Connor resisted the happy ending because it is both ridiculous and spiritually deadly to believe in a cheap version of happily ever after. Knowing this fact will set you free to experience real joy. O'Connor felt like she always had to explain that her vision of life was not at all dark. But anyone who has read her fiction closely knows this. In one of her letters, she wrote, quote, "Nah, I don't think life is a tragedy. Tragedy is something that can be explained by the professors. Life is the will of God, and this cannot be defined by the professors, for which all thanksgiving. I think it is impossible to live and not to grieve." So this is great. I think it is impossible to live and not to grieve, but I am always suspicious of my own grief, lest it be self-pity in sheep's clothing. And the worst thing is to grieve for the wrong reason, for the wrong loss. Altogether, it is better to pray than to grieve, and it is greater to be joyful than to grieve. But it takes more grace to be joyful than any but the greatest have. I think that O'Connor recognized that Americans, living as we do in the land of plenty, have become quite skilled at grieving over the wrong things. We grieve over our appearance, over taxes, over the loss of jobs, and even much pettier than that. What we should grieve over is our constant self-deceit that keeps us from looking honestly at ourselves. Because it is only when, I think, we see ourselves as the ogres that we are, that we can catch a joyful glimpse of the truly marvelous human beings that we were meant to become. Thank you.